you everybody for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon, midweek. I think many of us are probably looking forward to spring break. Um, and maybe some of you are on spring break and you're choosing to spend your lunch hour spring break here with us. So thank you for that. Like Vanessa said, we do have a very short hour with you, but we've condensed, um, packed this hour with some really cool stuff, really relative and practical resources for you today. So today it's all about linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, and we have a resource, a Jamboard, that's going to help you engage deeper into how to go about creating linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. So today is session 4, and if you've been joining us with session 1, you may have received a notification that we've added um, a new element, a new component to our series. And so if you haven't been joining us and this is your first time, please be aware that we added a new date and a new resource coming up in April. So stay tuned for that. And like all of our sessions, these sessions are recorded and pushed out to you shortly after we engage in this session together. Next slide, please. So your resources can be accessed through this bit.ly or this QR code. I know Vanessa has been dropping the link in the chat for easy access. And our goal today, our outcomes for today, can you go back real quick, are to become familiar with the Lagos template and literally to line up, or how we refer to connect the dots between language proficiency, the tools that are afforded to us and the ELD standards, and thinking about the student's disability and language supports that are necessary in order to provide access to the goal identified in the student's IEP. Now, again, the linguistically appropriate goals and objectives are a requirement for dually identified students. So we want to make sure that you have not only the appropriate resources that are necessary to draft appropriate logos, but also become familiar with the why behind that. Next slide. And again, you have access to our slide deck here. Real quick introduction. I'll give you a minute to access it. And I know Vanessa's dropping it in the chat. Okay. And we'll be dropping the link in the chat periodically as people are making their way into our session. Next slide, please. A real quick introduction to our team. We always take the time to let our participants know that the makeup of our team is very intentional. My background, although is not in special education, I've learned a tremendous amount of knowledge and skills, I would say, in working very closely with Vanessa and my other team members. My background is in general education. I'm a general education teacher by training, and I've been working here at the county office for 20 plus years in the curriculum department. The last 5 years here in the SELPA, doing this very important work under this grant work. My lens is English learners, and I've been very privileged and honored to be able to share that lens to this work, but not without the support of my counterpart, Vanessa. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa for her to quickly introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. So my background is, in fact, all things special education. I taught for 18 years at one of our local districts as a case manager SPED teacher in both an RSP and SDC setting. Additionally, when I came over to the SELPA, I took on the role of coordinator and also as an APE specialist and an AT assessor. So here at the SELPA, I work together with Lupita and Christina and Debbie to really provide a multidisciplinary team lens where we bring together our levels of expertise and experience to best serve students who are dually identified and those practitioners like you all here today who serve them. Lupita?
So just to round out our team, we have both Christina Zavala, who is our senior director. Her background is as a school psychologist and a special education director. Dr. Deborah Montoya, who without her, this work does not exist, although she's no longer employed by Imperial County Office of Education, SELPA. She is now a special education director in Oceanside. She's still very active and very involved in supporting this work as our executive consultant. And her background, she has a wide range in background, but by training, she is a bilingual school psychologist as well. So our role here as a Project Muse, we are a special education resource lead. We thank CCE and CDE for their support in continuing to fund this work. This is our second iteration of the grant. Our focus in this grant work is to build the capacity of our practitioners to connect with the other special education resource leads and other leads in support of special education at the state level. And again, like today, as facilitators and providing you resources and support through our grant work. Our grounding resource is the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. Although this is not a requirement, in other words, you are not required to use this resource, we do highly recommend that you dig into it a little bit, become familiar with these resources. We invite you to our website where we've actually taken it apart and we believe have made the different elements of this resource more user friendly. But again, this grounding resource is research based compilation of best practices. And so we encourage you to become familiar with it. So let's set the context for our session today. As many of you who are in special education are becoming more and more familiar with, especially if you're participating with us in these sessions, that a large percentage of students with disabilities are English learners. Currently, about 25% of a student who has an IEP is also an English learner, which means that there are two things that we must take into consideration. Their Title III requirements as English learners, federal Title III requirements as English learners, as well as their IDEA regs and requirements as a student with a disability. And so that is our approach in all of the work that we do. That is going to be our approach in the resource that we share with you today in developing linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. Next slide. So just a little bit of context so that we are all understanding the terminology that we're going to be using. Um, right now, long-term English learners are getting a lot of attention, especially long-term English learners who are also a student with a disability. So let's just set some common language, some common understanding of what and who we are referring to. A long-term English learner is an English learner who has been in American school for 6+ years and is not making progress and or is regressing. Typically, these are students that started at the elementary level and are now between 6th and 12th grade. And within that trajectory of their educational career, they've either plateaued or regressed academically and linguistically. And then another typology that we want to call to our attention here is our at risk of becoming a long-term English learner. So these are kiddos, again, who have been in our school system, American school system, for a minimum of 4 to 5 years and are showing evidence that they are beginning to become a long-term English learner. They are not progressing. They are not moving forward academically and or linguistically. And again, these are students that are at the upper elementary grades and can go all the way up to 12th grade. This is important information to share with you because the next slide is going to share some pretty stark data around this population of students. So the pie chart on your left is an English learner pie chart data. And really what I want to call your attention to are the contrast between English learners and English learners with disabilities. More specifically, let's look at the gray pieces of the pie chart, the long-term English learners. So you'll see that if you're an English learner student in the state of California, chances are that you will fall into this long-term English learner category at 11, like 11% of the students who are English learners are also long-term English learners. But when we contrast that with English learner with a disability, we see this tremendous uptick, right? We're close to 30%. So an English learner who has an IEP will become a long-term English learner more students with English learners who have an IEP will become long-term English learners than if you don't have an IEP and you're an English learner. So this is alarming data. And it really calls our attention to comprehensive ELD. What does it look like for dually identified students? And how might we be able to do a better job at addressing their linguistic needs? One last piece of data that I think is important to share are the top 3 qualifying categories for special education for English learners. The underlying factor here is language, speech and language disability, specific learning disability, and autism all have at the core language processing disorder. So it's important for us to be able to take that into consideration. All these factors that impact the students' ability to access content and engage and progress both academically and linguistically. So again, setting the context through this data is really important. Next slide, please. So we can't do this without leaning in on each other's expertise. Just like a little while ago, I introduced myself as not a special educator, but I do lean quite a bit on Vanessa and her lens and her area of expertise to help us navigate this work together. So again, by design, we do this work together because I need to be able to know and see and understand how to navigate through the IEP process when I'm thinking and talking about a student with an English learner, and Vanessa will do the same when when we have these conversations. She leans on me for things related to the ELD standards or Title III regs and things of that nature. So all of that to say that this work is a team lift approach, and not necessarily just the writing linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, but really moving the needle in providing quality instruction and access for dually identified students. So to set the context a little bit further, we're going to give you a little bit of time to think about a question here that Vanessa is going to walk us through. And this is one of the FAQs from the practitioner's guide. Vanessa?
Thank you, Lupita. So, as we zoom through this next section, I do want to spend some time considering this. Must English language development goals be included in the IEP? So, question, think about it, and give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, a Y, an N in the chat so that I know what the team is saying. Must ELD goals be included in the IEP? All right, survey says no. No, the answer is no. The IDEA requires that IEP goals be developed in areas of need related to the student's disability. And as we say ad nauseum, being an English learner is not a disability. So, really, what we want to do based on state and federal regulations is we want to develop IEP goals that are linguistically appropriate. Well, what does that mean? That means that they must be written at a student's level of linguistic ability based on their current ELD level, as evidenced by the LPAC or the Alt-LPAC and ELD performance. So again, a standalone ELD goal is not necessary. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? When we develop a goal, it's specific to the area of disability and how it is that we allow for the student to have educational benefit. Because we know that these are the 6 main principles of IDEA. We have FAPE, non-discriminatory evaluation, the IEP, parent and student participation, the least restrictive environment, and procedural safeguards. So as we aim to weave the thread of educational benefit, we know that we must develop goals, right? This section right here, to provide educational benefit for students with disabilities. And in the case of dually identified students, those goals need to be linguistically appropriate. And I know the term can be a little nebulous, especially when we're talking about goals that are developed within the context of the IEP team, and parents, guardians, and students contribute to the goals based on that assessment results. We're considering if the goal helps a student become independent, self-advocate, et cetera, et cetera. That also includes an element of being linguistically appropriate. And the only way we can make that determination is to be familiar with where our student is in their arc of language acquisition as they're learning English, being a multilingual learner with a disability. And to dig in a little bit deeper into those ELD standards, that ELAS, English language student acquisition level, I'm going to hand it over to Lupita so she can take us through that particular element so that then we can fully engage with the information that we need on the development of those linguistically appropriate goals.
Thanks,
Lupita?
Vanessa. So we're going to set the context again. So I whizzed you through some data slides, but again, it's important for us to recognize who we are working with so that we're able to utilize the tools that are afforded to us to be able to craft not only appropriate instruction, but in this case, the most effective, most accurate, linguistically appropriate goal for the students that we are serving. Next slide, please. So we want to share with you this resource from the California Practitioner's Guide. I believe if you click on the underlined figure 7.9, it should take you directly to the resource, but we will be dropping links in the chat uh, uh, for easy access from our website. So this is figure 7.9 are framing questions that we share with educators as they are designing instruction for English learners with disabilities. But I also want to use this resource as some kind of grounding, reflective questions as we're beginning to think about what are our current practices for designing linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, if they are truly happening and are they truly linguistically appropriate. So these are some considerations, and how might we enhance and ensure that they are accurate and relevant to the student's need. So here's some things underlined um, in this resource that I want you to be thinking about as we move forward. It's critical that we know and understand the student's language proficiency level beyond the number or the label. So beyond emergent, what does that mean and what does that look like relative to the student's disability? In order to do that, we also need to be able to be familiar with the ELD standards. The ELD standards are the grounding resource for designing and delivering comprehensive ELD instruction, which all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, must receive as part of their Title III services. And also the LPAC and excuse me, the LPAC, which is the summative assessment, language assessment for all English learners, requirement as well, is aligned to the ELD standard. So when we are assessing students' progress in language proficiency, think about the reclass data, the long-term English learner data. We want to make sure that we're using the standard so that we're teaching what we know students are going to be assessed on. We also want to consider the students' challenges, whether or not they are part of their disability. So sometimes, the disability will clearly call out what the student is struggling with and in which particular domain. But sometimes there are other factors that may not be called out in the IEP that we absolutely must take into consideration as we are crafting lessons and designing linguistically appropriate goals. Also, we want to make sure that students are given opportunities to engage in authentic language use at his or her language proficiency level. Therefore, we are also providing appropriate scaffolds, supports, accommodations, and modifications as identified in the student's IEP. These are critical factors in ensuring that we are providing effective, accurate, and appropriate support for our dually identified students. So let's spend a little bit of time having an understanding of the design of the ELD standard. So this graphic represents a high level overview of the organization of the ELD standard. So I'm going to walk you through each one of the parts and just kind of give you an kind of the gist of the purpose and goal for each one of the parts. So again, this graphic represents a high level overview of the organization of the ELD standards. So let's start with part one. Part one represents the concept or the goal of offering students opportunities to interact in language use in meaningful ways. And you see those three bubbles underneath with the titles of collaborative, productive, and interpretive. These are what are referred to as the modes of communication. The goal of part one, meaning the standards that are categorized under part one, are designed for teachers to be able to create opportunities for students to interact in meaningful ways. Collaborative opportunities where they are utilizing their listening and speaking skills. Productive opportunities where they are offered opportunities to engage in tasks that require them to use their speaking and writing skills, and providing appropriate scaffolds and support so that when they are reading and listening, that information that is coming in through their eyes or their ears is appropriately scaffolded and therefore accessible. So the standards in part one are specifically designed for teachers to be able to provide scaffolds, tasks, and opportunities so that students are able to interact in meaningful ways considering their language proficiency level. So now let's shift over to part two. Part two of the ELD standards, again, this is its own cluster of standards, have a very specific goal as well. Part two of the ELD standards are designed so that teachers are able to pull out opportunities from written text so that students are able to understand how the English language works. And how that is done is by taking text that students are reading and therefore writing about, and pulling out the language of the text that helps them see how language is connected and condensed, how language and what types of words and phrases and sentences are designed to expand and enrich ideas, and what types of words and phrases are used to be able to connect different ideas from, let's say, one paragraph to another, right? So that's structuring cohesive text. So these are considered the kind of the nuts and bolts of the English language so that it makes sense for meaning making. So less about underline the verbs, circle the nouns, more about how do these verbs impact what we're reading about in these nouns, and how does this paragraph relate to this paragraph, really unpacking language at the word, phrase, sentence, paragraph level so that we understand how language is organized and connects to make meaning. So part two standards are standards that teachers can utilize to focus in on how the English language works and using words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs to help students engage in reading and writing more effectively. So if we shift our eyes down to the very bottom, you'll notice part three, using foundational literacy skills. Part three of the ELD standards is not a separate set of standards, rather they are truly the foundational literacy skills. How part three standards, foundational literacy skills, and the Common Core standards are utilized as part of comprehensive ELD or crafting English language development lessons is when a student, let's say, is a newcomer, and we find out through data gathering and assessment that the student has limited um, literacy skills in English. In English. So we utilize the foundational literacy skills to fill in those literacy gaps. In other words, we are teaching the student how to decode, encode, all while using part one and part two. So we're filling in the literacy gaps that the student may have. And again, I'm using a newcomer as an example simply because by definition, a newcomer has had less than 12 months in an American school setting. Therefore, not always, but is fair to say, may not have literacy skills in English. So that's the whole purpose of part three and why they are important in this overall bird's eye view of the ELD standards. Vanessa, can you go back real quick? There's a couple of things that I want to point out before we move over. So there's the proficiency levels down at the bottom, emerging, expanding, and bridging. where we moved away from 5 levels to 3 levels, and this is what they are. But I really want to call attention to those arrows before, in between, and after those proficiency levels. So again, this is taking into consideration that language development does not go from one box to another box. uh, the language domains some language domains may develop a little faster than others. You may notice that some of your English learners are becoming more fluent in their speaking and perhaps even in their listening comprehension in English, and are still needing some extra support in their reading and writing. So that's just representative of that, is that as students are moving from one proficiency level to the other, that there may be some uh, uh, proficiency in some domains, but not all. And the other arrows that I want to call your attention to are in between the part one and part two cluster of bubbles. So the reason why those arrows are there and pointing in opposite directions is to indicate that the ELD standards are designed to be utilized uh, together. In other words, what you want to avoid is, I'm only going to focus on part one ELD standards, and then once the kids get those, I'm going to move into part two. Think about part two as the what and part one as the how. What I teach about English and how the students are going to interact so that they can practice and build mastery of the English. So they are designed to be used together. Okay, now we can move on. So, developing linguistically appropriate IEP goals means that we are using these resources to help us craft the goal, not cut and paste the standard and put it in the goal, because that doesn't do anything for the student. The ELD standards are going to help us design lessons so that let me go back. Let me go back. When we design the linguistically appropriate goal, we're taking into consideration the student's language proficiency level, so that when we use the standards to design the lesson, we're using that proficiency level standards to ensure that we're providing access, equitable access, and appropriate access, because we're using the student's language proficiency level as the guide. Next slide. Because again, comprehensive ELD is tier one core instruction for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. The next slide is going to give you a brief overview, and I'm going to walk you through what comprehensive ELD is here in the state of California. Comprehensive ELD is comprised of two types of English language instruction, and we don't get to pick and choose which one we want. English learners, including English learners with disabilities, must receive comprehensive ELD, which is both integrated ELD and designated ELD. So, quick overview of what integrated ELD is and what the goal and purpose is. So, integrated ELD will occur throughout the instructional day across content area, where the ELD standards are used to help us focus on the Common Core standards. So we're using them as a scaffold, if you will. So if I'm teaching science and I know I have a cluster of kiddos at the emerging level in my classroom, I'm going to scaffold that science lesson of thinking about that cluster of students in mind. And so rather than ask them to produce a 5 paragraph summary of a report, maybe I ask them to do a 1 paragraph, because that proficiency level in which they are in will be very challenging. If I ask them to do, they wouldn't be able to do it successfully. So again, integrated ELD, we use the standards, think of them as a scaffold to take into consideration the student's proficiency level and to provide access to the content area. So designated ELD is a protected time for all of your English learners, including your English learners with disability. Typically, during designated ELD, students are grouped by proficiency level, depending on the makeup of your school site. Sometimes they are classes. Sometimes it's a cluster within a class. Just depends on the numbers of English learners that you have. But it is a protected time where the ELD standards are the focal standards. We are teaching specifically English language development. We're not teaching math, we're not teaching science, we're not teaching social studies. We are teaching English language development using the context of any one of those content areas. But the focus is English language development. So, in a nutshell, comprehensive ELD is comprised of two types of ELD. Both of these ELD instruction opportunities are required for all English learners. Next slide. And again, I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa because this is our segue slide, but I think I see a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and ask them because I think I can address them out loud here. All English learners get integrated ELD and designated ELD. Yes. How much? It depends on you. There is no required time set forth. However, it is a required service. So students, as long as they're English learners, as long as they are engaging in comprehensive ELD, it must occur, both designated and integrated. Each LEA will have its own model per se, but it's not a must, it's not a may do, it's a must do. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa, and I'll keep my eye on the chat if there are any other questions. Take it over, Vanessa.
Thank you, Lupita. So let's wrap it up and bring it home in these last 30 minutes where we begin integrating all the things that Lupita and I talked about. So we talked about ELD goals not being standalone goals in the IEP, but more linguistically appropriate. And the question is always, well, what makes a goal linguistically appropriate? We reference the LPAC and the Alt-LPAC to determine where the students are in that language acquisition arc. And before we move forward, it's important for us to know how it is that these are assessed. So in the OG LPAC, we assess 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, writing, right? If you recall, the previous slide about the ELD standards shows how we are able to engage, interact in meaningful ways by listening, speaking, reading, and writing, right? So when we are generating that when our students are generating that overall performance on the LPAC score, we typically look at that overall, right? And that will be either bridging, expanding, et cetera, et cetera. However, it's important for us to know how it is that these domains align and how they make these language composites. So the 4 areas that are assessed: listening, speaking, reading, writing. But if we look vertically, we look at the receptive domains, listening and reading, and then the expressive domains, speaking and writing. So I want us to pause right here and start thinking of the disability categories, how they might manifest in individual students, and what impacts those might have in regards to the receptive domains and the expressive domains. Next, I want us to consider these domains horizontally. Oral language, okay? Oral language comprised of speaking and listening. Those are the 2 domains that comprise oral language composites. Considering the disabilities of the students that I serve, how the disability manifests, and any impact to speaking and listening. The bottom half is the written language composite, comprised of the 2 domains, reading and writing. Again, thinking back to the disabilities of the students I serve, the goals that I develop for them, and how that disability may manifest in reading and writing. So it's important for us to be oriented in what it is that the LPAC generates, because truth be told, again, as an 18-year veteran of the classroom, as a special education teacher, back in my days of the CELT, I was just populating numbers with no real understanding of what those raw scores were, what those levels were, and how it is that my goal was linguistically appropriate. And it was through years of learning and training and participating in opportunities such as this one that I was able to see that through line, that I was able to connect the dots. And it is these experiences that allowed me and Lupita to come together and really think about how it is that we can help make the process visible. So for the time that we have together today, I want us to put on our dual lens of English language proficiency and disability category, without losing sight of some of the data that we've shared in the data slides. So when we think about English learners with disabilities, we know that oftentimes what happens is that the expectation is that our students receive everything in the context of the special education classroom. Therefore, completely ignoring the fact that special education is a service, not a place, right? You go to that place to get all of your services, when really it should be a layered approach. So I want us to think of the top three disability categories: SLD, SLI, and autism. And if you work with students with disabilities, I want you to think of a particular student. If you have a child who is a student with a disability, um, like I do, my son's on the autism spectrum, is an English learner, has a secondary of OHI for ADHD. What might a linguistically appropriate goal look like for this student? And also considering that all English learners are not monolithic. It's not a monolithic group. We have a vast array. So keeping all of that in mind, let's think about communication. Let's think about communication skills in English via the performance areas of the LPAC. And the alternate LPAC is a little bit different. The alternate LPAC is the English language assessment in the state of California for students with more significant cognitive disabilities. There is a receptive language and an expressive language composite that generates a score. But knowing what the structure is, how it is organized, receptive language being the listening and reading, and the expressive language being the speaking and writing, we can still consider those performance areas. So when we are looking at how it is that students scored on the LPAC, how they scored on the alternate LPAC, oftentimes we don't spend much time really looking at the details. So in the past, I don't know if this still happens, teachers would have access to the student score report. So this is a sample SSR, student score report, that gives us some information. So if you're wondering, okay, Vanessa, you keep talking about linguistically appropriate, but how do I know where it is that they are in this process? So your score report might look a little bit different, but it will give you the following information. It will give you the overall score. It will give you a raw score, and it will tell you moderately developed. What does that mean? Well, if we look at this bottom portion of the page, we can see that moderately developed, it really points out the fact that a student can usually use English to learn new concepts in school. Okay, that gives me some information, but this is just overall. And I'm thinking of a student like my son who's on the autism spectrum, where his language is absolutely impacted, not necessarily because he's an English learner, but because he struggles with that expressive language. I'm going to pay close attention to these composites over here. When we're looking at the oral language composite, I know that's inclusive of listening and speaking. This student right here is a level 3, moderately developed. However, upon closer inspection, I see that in listening, he's performing at the well-developed range, whereas in speaking, somewhat moderately. So when I'm considering the goals that I'm going to develop for this student, and the output of that goal is a listening skill, has a large listening component, I know that he's going to require less linguistic supports than he or she might when it relates to speaking. So hopefully this is helping you sort of think like, okay, I'm beginning to see how it is that a goal becomes linguistically appropriate. And spoiler alert, it's not clicking the box that it's linguistically appropriate. Next one, written language. Here, again, the level 3 matches to the overall. However, if I pay close attention to the composite, the written language composite, I'm looking at reading and writing. For this particular student, reading is well developed, whereas writing is somewhat moderately developed. Again, giving me a clue, giving me an indication that the scaffolds and supports that the student might need in addressing the goal that is developed for them they're going to need less supports, less structures, less scaffolding. Not gone altogether, but just less, because it's also going to depend on the context, right? And then with the writing, we know that the level of support is going to be a little bit more of a requirement for providing access to those goals and being able to demonstrate access and being able to demonstrate progress towards meeting those annual goals. So, in a nutshell, all of those points that I shared with you earlier, um, keeping this image in mind, it's important for us to consider the following questions before we actually jump into the Jamboard. Number one, how does the disability manifest? Student who qualifies under OHI for anxiety. Anxiety sometimes or most of the time manifests as selective mutism. I'm beginning to think that if I develop a goal where I'm expecting the student to use expressive language, I'm going to need some specific language supports related to speaking and writing. I know that they are an emerging, meaning they're a level 1 in their language acquisition. So even with scaffolds, the writing component, even though the student is in 6th grade, I'm not going to be requiring a full paragraph because language-wise, they're not there yet. They're at that emergent level. And that is then compounded by the manifestation of the disability, OHI, anxiety, selective mutism, and I'm going to craft a goal that takes all of those into consideration so that my student can fully access the curriculum. Okay, I'm going to give you a second to sort of let that settle because now we're going to play. We are going to play and apply some of what we've learned right now in Armando's scenario. So here is Armando, and here is a snippet of what we were able to extract from the present levels. Again, fictional child. The present levels indicate that an area of need is reading comprehension and fluency. So keep that in mind. I know that Armando is an English learner. So number one, we need linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, logos. Okay, that's one thing I need. I know that I'm going to need a baseline related to the area of the ELD standards proficiency. I know that these are going to be tied to the conditions and support that are included in the linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. I know that I'm going to need to consider accessibility resources that can be replicated in the classroom during instruction, and perhaps assistive technology to ensure that this dually identified student has access to a linguistically appropriate goal that will support him meeting that goal.
Vanessa,
Yes.
quick question that I think is a good one to answer out
Mhm.
loud. Should ELD goals include all 4 domains? I'm going to start off and then you finish it off.
Okay.
So, linguistically appropriate goals and objectives should consider the student's language proficiency level as it pertains to where it manifests as a result of the student's disability. Tag, you're it.
Okay. So thank you for that, for pointing it out, Lupita, because I think it's important for us to just square away the following. So linguistically appropriate goals are not ELD goals. So I know that there's been some confusion or just we're not necessarily clear, especially if we are new to the field or have been receiving different information. But what we're talking about here are linguistically appropriate goals. Remember that the goals in the IEP are tied to a disability area. Remember, assessment drives present levels identify areas of need identify goals. Goals then drive services, right? So we're connected. So if we are developing goals to address area of need based on the disability, EL is not a disability. So we wouldn't have an ELD goal per se. Rather, the goal would address the manifestation of the disability and in establishing that educational benefit, right? So in keeping that in mind, the goals that you develop, because the IEP is designed to address those individual needs of the student, you're only developing goals that address that manifestation of the disability. So, for example, if the student has only a reading fluency goal, you wouldn't necessarily have to craft additional goals in writing or in listening when the goal is just on fluency. Again, depending on what your goal looks like, right? So the goal is linguistically appropriate by providing those necessary language scaffolds that will make that goal accessible for an English learner. So let's work through the Armando example so that it can become a little bit clearer. So Armando has a summative LPAC level 2. The previous year, he was a level 1. So he made a year's growth. His ELD proficiency level is expanding, which means that he requires moderate linguistic support. He qualified for services under SLD, specifically for phonological processing. The present levels indicate that reading fluency and comprehension are low compared to his grade level peers. The present levels also identify math, fractions, and multi-digit numbers as an area of weakness based on the WJ4 and work samples. The team determined that for the student to receive ed benefit, goals would be written in those areas to address the following areas of need. He is currently reading at the 3rd grade level with 80% accuracy in reading comprehension texts when vocabulary is front-loaded using picture cards and or explained in context. He likes using speech to text, though some words are typed incorrectly due to some pronunciation errors because his production of English language phonemes are at times inconsistent. So hopefully this is giving you a picture of what Armando looks like in the classroom. So knowing that, I want you to lend a critical eye to this goal that was drafted based on the student profile I just gave you on the previous slide. The area of need is reading comprehension as identified on the present levels page. Here's my baseline. Armando scored at level 2, somewhat developed on the LPAC. He requires moderate linguistic supports to access content area text. When provided audio and digital notes, Armando can highlight accurately. When explaining or drawing inferences from text, he can also use labeled and partially completed graphic organizers to compare and contrast up to 2 characters and or events in a familiar story. And he can recall orally specific details in the text with verbal prompting, sentence frames, word banks, and media. So I know that this baseline is a little bit of overkill, but I just wanted to give you a good example of some of the things that you could include in that baseline and developing that logos. So here is goal 1 of 1. When given a graphic organizer, Armando will compare and contrast 2 or more events in a grade level read aloud text by drawing on specific details, how the characters interact, as measured with 80% accuracy in 5 trials of student work, samples, teacher charted records. Okay, so what would you add? What would you remove? Or what questions do you have related to this goal? Use the chat and drop your feedback in there. Remember, friends, this is a brave space where we can learn together. What are you thinking? Let's scaffold the feedback. So the goal is on reading comprehension. Armando, because he is at that slightly emergent level, remember, he was a level 1, now he's a level 2, right? We know that he is reading at 80% grade level text. How is it that Armando is going to be producing? Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so how will it be? Will it be orally? Will it be written? Perhaps we want to add some more specific language supports. Absolutely. Absolutely. Visual supports, right? Is the graphic organizer the only support? We don't know, right? We don't know. We don't know specifically what is going to work for Armando in regards to those linguistic supports. But guess what? You can always refer back to those ELD standards to give you an idea of how to scaffold those supports. So it is important for teams, it is important for practitioners who are developing these linguistically appropriate goals to have who at the table? Your ELD counterpart. So when Lupita and I talk about the team lift, we absolutely mean it. As a special education teacher, I may not have the information that I need to select or to even know what array of linguistic supports are available for my students when they're English learners. And guess what, guys? That is okay. That is when you maybe knock on some doors, pick up the phone, or walk across the hallway with a peer who is a little bit more familiar with those ELD standards, a lot more familiar with those ELD standards. That could be your ELD TOSA, your student's ELD teacher, an EL specialist, whoever it is that's available to you to give you some additional feedback and ideas as how to provide those linguistic supports for a particular student. So the conversation could go something like this. Hey, Armando, I am writing a reading comprehension goal for him. And this is what he can do. He's at a level 2 on the LPAC, but just last year he was a level 1, and the year prior to that he was a new arrival. Um, what could I do for him to provide some linguistic supports? That is where that collaborative effort comes in that multidisciplinary team approach that then becomes that team lift to developing those linguistically appropriate goals. And with that end in mind, we've attached a link to this Padlet that gives you access to the ELD standards as organized by LAUSD. And if you look just very briefly at this section, you'll see that it calls out some of the parts that Lupita mentioned in her slides earlier: collaborative, interpretive, etc. And you can see by grade level what it could potentially look like. So for example, when we're talking about interacting in meaningful ways, that collaborative component, engagement and dialogue with others, we said Armando is at the expanding level. This is kindergarten, so it might not be appropriate for his grade level, but it gives you an opinion as how it builds across those proficiency levels to give you opportunities to then select ideas on what a linguistically appropriate support would be to make these goals linguistically appropriate. Okay, so here we are at the Jamboard. So this Jamboard will provide you an opportunity to access, oh, is it not linked in there? Lupita, I think it's in the notes section of the slide deck. Could you drop that link in there, please? Because what the Logos Jamboard activity does is it allows you to play. Our end result today is to give you this tool so that you can access this Jamboard, take it back to your sites, and apply what you've learned and try out what a linguistically appropriate goal might look like. It's going to look something like this. Thank you, Joyce, on slide 36. So it's going to look something like this. So the Jamboard gives you an idea of what linguistically appropriate goals look like for third grade, seventh grade, and high school. So if you want to familiarize yourself with what it could potentially look like, we're looking at the key idea and detail, right, for the standard, the ELD part 1 standard, and what the goal could look like. So again, some examples of a linguistically appropriate goal. However, the real value is in you having an opportunity to develop your own linguistically appropriate goals. So you have Armando as your starting point to start developing some present levels. So how could you do that? Well, you can start by writing a sample goal as a group. You can begin considering the identified area of need and English language acquisition stage, the relationship between the performance levels and the ELD standards, and using all of these scaffolds to help you think about how it is that you would develop that goal. So this becomes a workbook of sorts where you're practicing how to develop these goals with a team as a means of engaging in a professional learning, a community or a community of practice, to be able then to take additional student profiles and start developing some Jamboards that take all of these different elements into consideration, and again, provide you that ability to be able to practice in writing those goals, because it really begins with a traditional IEP goal. So this is just a 6-part goal formula that brings it together. And on top of that, what we do is we layer those linguistic supports that are available in those ELD standards, right? That'll give you an idea of what the expectation is in regards to that language, whether it be expressive or receptive, and how it links to that IEP goal. You can also access some of these student cards, Jai, Tasha, Rosie, and Chris, to practice writing some linguistically appropriate goals in the IEP process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lupita to take us home. I know, like, with 1 minute to spare, Lupita, apologies for that, but there you
All right, Vanessa, thank you. I'm going to drop in the chat real quick the landing page for all of our appendices, just sharing, highlighting a couple of gathering observational data tools. So these appendices, you can see the title there, are designed to be able to be accessible for you, downloadable, printable, for you to be able to utilize to gather information on the English learner teacher, information about what classroom looks like, as well as what focused ELD instruction looks like. Again, more data paints a more comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do and where we might be able to fill in some gaps. Additionally, we want to share with you the infographic for Chapter 5, where you're going to find anything and everything related to developing the IEP, including this element of logos. So we invite you to check it out. You can also visit our website for all the other chapters on the practitioner's guide as well. And with that, we're right on the money, 1:30. We ask you to please, please, please give us your feedback. We know that 1 hour is not sufficient, but we do want to take advantage of at least this little bit of time to highlight and showcase some of the resources that we've developed based on asks of the field. So these resources are in response to what folks have been asking and suggesting that we develop, because they're great needs. So We're going to drop the link to the survey in the chat. Please just take a couple of minutes to give us your feedback. It's really important. It helps our funders recognize that this work is important and hopefully will continue to fund us. So again, your feedback is really important. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And those of you taking off for spring break, be safe, be blessed, and hopefully we'll see you back soon. Thank you.